Thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you for caring about this whole idea of finding common ground. And tonight we're going to, as Bruce said, we're going to talk about then and now, see what's different and what could be the same, and what lessons we can learn perhaps from the Reagan-O'Neill years. Let's begin by getting personal with the past. We're going to look at leadership styles and the relationship that drove the President and the Speaker of the House during the 1980s and see what we can learn from that. But before we begin, let's listen to President Reagan speaking at a dinner honoring Tip O'Neill on March 17th, 1986. And as you listen, try to imagine President Obama saying the same words to Speaker Boehner today.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you know Tip and I have been kidding each other for some time now, and I hope you also know how much I hope this continues for many years to come. A little kidding is, after all, a sign of affection, the sort of things that friends do to each other. And Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful you have permitted me in the past, and I hope in the future, that singular honor, the honor of calling you my friend. I think the fact that of our friendship is testimony to the political system that we're part of and the country we live in. A country which permits two not so shy and not so retiring Irishmen to have it out on the issues rather than on each other or their countrymen.
So, Chris, you've just written the book on this. What was different about those two men, and what was different about, and can you imagine that today? What was it about the two?
Well, David knows better about this, but I think it was that, first of all, they were both older men, and they were getting old. They knew that this was their last act. So it wasn't going to be about posturing and press releases and speeches. It was going to be about getting things done. And that was a big difference from today, the sense of urgency, that you had to meet deadlines, you had to make deals. I also think Ronald Reagan was a very interesting political figure because although he would pamphleteer on the right and read Human Events, when he governed in California, he was a moderate centrist conservative. And when he was president, he was the same. So, and O'Neill, my boss, despite his liberal gut, would make deals. And I think they were both professionals. I think today we have politicians who want to give really good speeches and want to posture, and that's the end game. And I think that's the difference, productivity.
David, we're going to talk a little bit more about that period, but first I just maybe thought for our audience we would come up to the present. We've got Patty Murray and Paul Ryan, and we've got some kind of a budget deal after a huge amount of partisan divide in Washington. Mm-hmm. Take a minute and tell us whether you see any possibility that there's a breakthrough going on here, or and whether the discourse that's so divided changes because of this kind of thing, or is it just a momentary blip?
Well, first of all, let me join Chris in saying how appreciative we are to be here tonight. And Chris has written a really good book, and it's a great read. So when you go to the book signing tonight, I hope you'll buy his book. It's well worth it. He won't say that, but actually he would. But I can, and I'm delighted that I'm coming back. I hope to see some of you. We're doing a series this spring on leadership, and I hope we'll have a chance to see some of you a little later in the year or next year. But today, look, Chris may disagree with this, but I don't think this was a breakthrough. I think it was a muddle through. You know, it was sort of the bare necessities to keep things going. The Republicans got badly hurt over these shutdowns. They didn't want to go through that disaster. They'd rather keep campaigning on Obamacare, and they wanted to take that. They didn't want another shutdown to interfere if they could possibly help it. I think it is good news for possibly, you know, there's still a big question about the government debt limit will be hit again next year, but I think this suggests they'll find a way out of it. But, you know, there's an old saying that in the desert, a one-story building looks like a skyscraper. And that's true of this bill. This is like a one-story building. This ain't a big deal. I just want to give you Politico yesterday came out with a piece that I'm sure Chris has read about what this Congress has done. They have passed some 50 laws so far this year. I want to give you the names of some of them. The United States Parole Commission Extension Act of 2013. The School Access to Emergency Epinephrine, what do I know? The Organization of American States Revitalization and Reform Act. The Helium Stewardship Act of 2013.
That's a big one.
The Powell Shooting Range Land Conveyance Act. The District of Columbia Chief Financial Officer Vacancy Act. Whoa, that saved the day, didn't it? And then there's a bill that even specified, quote, the size of the precious metal blanks that will be used in the production of the National Baseball Hall of Fame commemorative coins. Don't you feel more comfortable as Americans than congratulate this Congress.
Okay, so it's not a great time in Washington. Let's go back.
We didn't need to come here tonight.
We didn't need that. Right. Let's go back to the 80s, and you guys are on separate sides, right? I mean,
I knew who he was.
You knew
I knew what he was doing.
He was.
Yeah, okay.
I watched him.
He was the guy writing the one-liners or
the snappers. Yeah.
That was a pivotal election
I had
year,
to introduce Tip O'Neill to Jewish humor. That was my job. One-liners, that was my specialty.
Yeah.
So, I mean, 1980 was a pivotal election year. I remember I was in Cairo as a foreign correspondent at the time, and this Egyptian foreign ministry official was just beside himself that an actor could become the president of the United States. He was sure that the United States would have to change its political system. You know, that was how shocking it was in much of the world.
Well, we just had a peanut farmer there.
Well, there you go.
Okay.
But then...
Well, look, I think a lot of... First of all, Reagan was an autodidact, like a lot of us are in later life. Either you are or you aren't. You don't keep going to school. You either keep learning or you don't. And Ronald Reagan, based upon his diary, based upon the letters he wrote in the 50s, the commentaries he wrote personally, they're all available now, thanks to Doug Brinkley. Mm-hmm. This man may not have been broad in his thinking, but he was very intense, and he took seriously a couple things. I thought Jim Baker said it best, who was himself, as David knows, the best chief of staff we've ever had for a president. And he basically said when it came to the issues he cared about, he was solid. There are obviously areas that, like Middle East politics, everybody was off the beam on. Nobody understood it when it really struck us with the Marine barracks being... Tip O'Neill said, we never thought it would be a terrorist attack. I mean, it was just a whole... They thought people came in uniforms and attacked by... They didn't know they got a crazy car bomber came through the gates in the middle of the night. So, but when it came to fighting communism, he knew his communists. He knew them at home, he knew them abroad. He got them, he had their number. And when it came to his beliefs on the economy, they were solid and he knew where to negotiate. He knew what he believed in, and he personified conservatism. So I think the idea he was just an actor. One thing I tried to bring out in this book was he was always a citizen politician. And the acting was a career, but his heart was in leading people up against the establishment. He always wanted to, ever since his days as a student at college, he wanted to lead the strike. He wanted to speak for the people against the power. That's what he always wanted to do.
David, you were seeing him up close.
Yeah, but listen, I think this is bigger than Reagan and O'Neill. I think Chris has told a wonderful story which helps to see it up close. But this is about a political culture of that time. These were men of their own time, and it's a very different time. It's a very different culture. You know, Chris and I both came to Washington before that. You came back...
71.
71. And I came at just about that same period of time. And that was a period when the World War II generation was running the country. And basically, we had a group of presidents from Kennedy through George Bush Sr., 7 presidents, all of whom came of age during the World War II period. All 7 wore a military uniform. Yeah. 6 of them served during the war. Jimmy Carter was in the Naval Academy when the war ended, and he went on to serve honorably as a submariner. And that service when they were young, fighting under the same flag, believing they were part of the same country, and it was a victorious war, gave them a sense of bonding that made an enormous difference right on through that period. So what you had was, that, as President Reagan said in one of those clips, people in effect came in, they were strong Democrats, they were strong Republicans, but they thought of themselves as first and foremost strong Americans. Mm-hmm. And that made a major difference because they thought the country came first, it came before party, and it even came in front of, they obviously fought for their own reelection. But one of the wonderful things about Reagan and Tip O'Neill was that they would fight like hell, because Chris points out in his book, they would fight like hell during the day. Chris would turn out those one-liners, we'd volley back and forth, but at 6 o'clock at night, they called a truce. Mm-hmm. And that's when they could lift up a glass and tell old Irish yarns and laugh, scratch, have a good time. Chris tells a wonderful story in his book about the party when Reagan gave that birthday party for
in December of '69.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, '89. I'm sorry, '81. It was the first year, and Kenny Duberstein told me a lot about it. He was there, and Reagan wrote about it, and it was Tip's birthday, and Reagan hosted it at the White House. It was a stag dinner. It was basically a bunch of guys sitting around. Deaver, I think, was there, and Duberstein. Kenny was one of the top congressional relations people. And Reagan really got into it. He told this over-the-top Irish thing about how if I have a ticket to heaven and you don't,
you don't have one too.
And you don't have one too. You know the lyricism. I'll give you mine. I'll give away mine and go to hell with you. Which was obviously an overstatement, but because they're both believers, so it wasn't really meant to be true. And then he went in, and he really kind of ceremoniously, because Reagan hardly drank at all. He drank like my dad used to drink, like a sip or two to keep the company. Tip drank differently, but he didn't drink at work. I'll tell you that. I never saw him drink. The only time I ever saw the slightest, no, Moynihan's a different case. The only time I ever noticed the slight influence of alcohol was I called him one Saturday afternoon. He'd obviously been out playing golf, and it was at the 19th hole with some old general somewhere up in the Cape, and he was too nice to me. Now, this wasn't the Tip I'd gotten to know. This wasn't the boss talking to me. This was a guy having a good time. But Reagan says, bring on the champagne. It was like in the movies. And they bring on the champagne. They were there the whole afternoon. I think, I don't want to belittle this because as Kirk O'Donnell, the chief of counsel of the Speaker, who was in many ways the leader of all of this, he'd been with him forever, he said you have to always be able to talk. And this is true in marriage, this is true with kids. Always be able to talk. Never get to the point where we're not talking. And Reagan and Tip, because of the Irish background, because of the age similarity, because of spending a lot of time together in these social occasions, all those Irish lunches and all that stuff, were able to get on the phone. And this is the key thing you mentioned. Get on the phone. Hey, Tip, what time is it? Can you reset your watch? Can you make it 6 o'clock? I want to talk to you about something. And he could do that. And in his diary in the beginning especially, he said things, I'm getting more help from O'Neill, the Democrats, than I'm getting from the Republicans. I mean, it was hot. It was heavy. It was tough. It was brutal at times. Yeah. But the best thing about it was they both knew there was a clock ticking in this country on saving Social Security, on reforming the tax system.
And they got both done.
On ending the Cold War. Tip played a very small part in that. It was the best he could do, which was to back Reagan up every time he met with Gorbachev. In fact, even before he met with him over there, and delivered a letter from Reagan saying how much he wanted to meet with Gorbachev, and then saying how much Reagan spoke for the country. There was going to be no second front or no division of this country. And then he went back and told the Freeze people to shut it down for a while. He talked them into doing it, Dellums and Markey. He also he said, no fighting over defense spending while Reagan's in Geneva. I want him to be able to pick up the check. That was Tip's line. Okay. So when you talk about patriotism, it was there.
Yeah, John, let me ask you one other thing. That was a generation that was full of wit as well, and it was bipartisan in nature. Republican Bob Dole walks into a gridiron dinner one night, one of those big fancy press dinners in Washington, and up on the dais were 3 former presidents, Jimmy Carter, Jerry Ford, and Richard Nixon. Dole, deadpans, look up there, hear no evil, see no evil, and evil.
Only Dole.
Only Dole. And he was a Republican. He loved Nixon, but they didn't let anything. And he gave a eulogy at the funeral. They all wept.
You know, it wasn't just these two guys. I want to generalize because there's a great story about how a lot of it is technical. I don't want to. I'll call some names out. But when they used to travel by car, that changed. That was the old way. Tip would drive down. It took a while to get from Boston to Washington. It's a nice ride. I'll give you a better ride. Every weekend, Rostenkowski, Democrat from the Daily Machine, would ride out with Bob Michael, the top Republican. 2 guys in the front seat, one driving, one keeping the guy awake, and 2 guys lying on a mattress in a station wagon in the back. 14-hour rides every week, back and forth. You develop a relationship. Women think guys don't talk. I hate to break it to you. They do. But they don't talk right away. But about 3 hours into the trip, they're probably saying, I got this kid. I don't know. If he doesn't stop drinking, I'm going to die. Or if the kid would just study his homework. Or this wife is finally mad at me about this job. I'm never home. She's at home. She's got to deal with all this mess, but Monday through Thursday, and I'm down here having a good time. It's getting very hot at home. These kind of conversations bond you.
So
they just do.
That's actually getting into a thing that I wanted to talk
That's
about,
all
which is
gone.
these structural changes. You've talked about a generational change. You've talked. We know we can't replicate the personalities of that time necessarily, but you've also got people who aren't spending time with one another in Washington, and then you've got these other factors, right? The 24-hour news cycle, 24/7 news cycle, which I think maybe you guys know something about, especially you, Chris. You've got redistricting. You've got all these various things that have polarized the nation and made the discourse very sharp and very divided. You know, I just wonder if in '83, I remember the barracks bombing in Beirut. If that happened today, you know, if you think about that kind of thing today, would you get the kind of closing of ranks, or would it just all be sniping at political sniping?
We had a closing of ranks after 9/11. You know, and there was a moment we thought that we were going to come together for a long period of time. Unfortunately, it vanished very quickly. Mm-hmm. But I do think there's something to this notion that the people are much more isolated from each other in Washington than they once were, and there's no. You know, the fact that everybody feels the need to go home, because you can get home mm-hmm. by plane to California. Yeah. So people do, you know, because it's there you go. And the result is, when do they tend to go out on Thursday and they come back on Monday night. And, you know, that's a hell of a lot of time to spend in Washington. And more importantly, their families stay back in the district or back home in most cases. So when Chris and I got there, the families lived cheek by jowl. Their kids played on the same soccer teams. They went to the same churches or synagogues or mosques. And they spent time together, and that is all sort of dissipated out. And we had people in Washington. There was a time in Washington when a Kay Graham, this grand lady, would give a dinner or reception, and it was a must. You had to go. It was a command performance. And when you got there, you knew there were people not like you. Mm-hmm. People who had very different views from you. That's all disappeared now. If you gave one of these dinners this time, you know, like if you had Boehner come to the White House, he probably brings a food taster, you know.
Well, the one thing, that's all true, by the way. Just to add to that, the 24-hour thing. By the way, I like the hour news cycle, at least 1 hour a night. I like that part of it. I get the sense, watching the news like David does, pretty much hour by hour. Every couple hours, I try to keep up. And what happens now is John Boehner, who's a regular Republican, we recognize him. He's Jerry Ford, he's Bob Michael, he's Bob Dole. He's anybody we grew up with, regular business Republican, kind of small town guy, the heart of the Republican Party, the Midwest. And it's no longer the power in the Republican Party, that's Southern. But he'll leave the White House, the North Lawn. I can imagine him almost in the car. As he gets in the car, he takes a call from his chief of staff, who says, "You can't stick to that deal I just heard about. They're already raising hell about it, and I don't know where Cantor is on this." By the time he gets back there, he's basically taken back every deal he's made, because there's no confidence kept anymore. And Obama's bad at this too, I think, because I've seen where somebody will say something and it's out. You know,
yeah, I agree.
Who's putting this stuff out? Who's leaking this, what we call TikTok? I mean, you used to have to do it as part of your job. TikTok is what you give to the weekend magazines to give them a little color, to fill in. Now it's given out on the spot, and you can't keep a secret. I don't think there's a confidential relationship between the president and the speaker, and there should be a confidential relationship, meaning they should be able to talk to each other and not have it leak. Well, and I don't think that's there anymore.
Let me show you something. We've got some video here it's very interesting. It's video of our leaders in Congress during the recent government shutdown. You may remember this. It's Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul speaking. And they thought they were speaking privately, but there's an open mic. And then and we're going to go to a next one, which is John Boehner, and you sort of get a sense of the level of discourse. But let's take a look at this video and see if we can make some meaning out of it.
I'm all wired up here.
I just did CNN, and I just go over and over again, we're willing to compromise, we're willing to negotiate. I don't think they poll tested we won't negotiate. I think it's awful for them to say that over and over again.
Yeah, I do too. And I just came back from the 2-hour meeting with them, and that was That was basically the same view privately as it was publicly.
I think if we keep saying we wanted to defund it, we fought for that, but now we're willing to compromise on this, I think they can't. And we're going to, I think, well, I know we don't want to be here, but we're going to win this, I think.
Trashy.
Yeah. That's an open mic, and then we've got this.
I was at the White House the other night and listened to the president some 20 times explain to me why he wasn't going to negotiate. Sat there and listened to the majority leader in the United States Senate describe to me that he's not going to talk until we surrender. And then this morning, I get the Wall Street Journal out, and it says, well, we don't care how long this lasts because we're winning. Now, this isn't some damn game.
I mean, that's pretty toxic, isn't it? That's the kind of talk that goes on there. First of all, you've got the open mic. You've got basically cameras and nothing's private any longer, which is what you were talking about. And then you've got this level of animus. You know, is this a relationship, you think, between the president and the Speaker of the House, or the Republicans and the Democrats? Is it a marriage that can be saved? Is there anything that can happen to improve that? Or is it just split?
Not on this watch.
Not on this watch.
Not on this watch.
Chris?
Yeah, I think it's different than it used to be, and you know, old times look better because this aspect is missing. I mean, Tip, before he retired, after he retired, he was asked by somebody, like when he was still alive, and he was asked, what do you think of the new crowd? He said, the people are better, the system's worse. They're cleaner, they're smarter, much better educated than they used to be, but they don't know how to work together. Isn't that interesting? The people are better, the system's worse. And I think that in the past there was some corruption.
Well, you talk about that.
I
you
talk
about that with
how they
Tip.
protect each other
Yeah.
when they play cards with each other at night. He said, I don't want a guy to go to go to prison. They'd look out for people when they got in trouble. That's the bad part. But at least they knew each other and they liked each other enough to protect each other. But the public wasn't served in that. Let me give you an example. Earmarks. Everybody, you know, John McCain made a great campaign against them to the point there's no earmarks now, no special marks that says this shall go to a Catholic college located somewhere between Cambridge and Watertown or something like that, and it'll be a school of certain size, and of course that's what will be the school they earmarked it for. Now you can't do that to thank somebody or to grease the skids a little bit, get people in to help you. You can't say, okay, I'll take care of that college of yours, or I'll take care of that charity of yours, or a hospital. And therefore, there's no way to sort of buy each other. Now, that's gone. People would say, that's great that that's gone. But replace it with something, you know?
Yeah, listen, this is not just a story about the Congress. It's a bigger story. It's also a story about how the executive branch, how the White House interacts with the Congress. And there's a play coming here at Broadway called, it's about LBJ. And it's called All the Way. It's a terrific play. And it's coming this January or February. In any event, what you see in there is that Lyndon Johnson, as a Democrat, almost every day at 5 o'clock would call Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader of the Senate, and they'd talk for 20 or 30 minutes about, you know, what was going on and compare notes. And Johnson did that because he really felt it was important to establish comedy across the aisle. And it's 1964, and in 1965, when Lyndon Johnson wanted to pass the civil rights bills, he really wanted Republican buy-in, and he could go to Everett Dirksen and persuade him to support those two bills, and it made a huge difference to get supermajorities, to get a significant number of Republicans to do that. Unfortunately, with this White House, President Obama has many, many good qualities. He's a man of character. He's very smart. I think he really cares about the country. He is an insular sort of person. And so he and John Boehner simply don't have that guy. He didn't call McConnell, the senator, when the Senate leader on the Republican side, he didn't call him for months in the beginning of the administration. And let me give you another example. Golf. You know, many people, some people here play golf, I'm sure. And you know what that's sort of socially liquefying. It really helps relationships. Well, the president played 104 rounds of golf in the first term. 104 opportunities to reach out to members of Congress and form relationships. Over that 104 rounds, he asked a Democratic member of Congress twice, play golf with him? Climber,
a Democrat?
Twice. He asked one Democrat, twice. And he asked John Boehner once. 104 rounds, that was it. Now, if you want to establish relationships of trust, as Chris says, you've got to spend some time together, and you've got to sort of share some experiences together. And what was happened here has been a complete breakdown in the relationship between John Boehner and President Obama. They never built bonds to start with. Now they each feel betrayed by the other one along the way, and they really don't like each other. And that makes a big difference. It's such a long way we've come from a Reagan relationship or the Lyndon Johnson, Everett Dirksen, both, which was bipartisan, a Democratic president, a Republican president, to where we are now.
There's another piece, though, and I think this conversation is critical, but there's another ancillary part of this, which is the arrival of people that really don't want to be part of Washington. I mean, they sort of come to the town and say, I'm not going to meet anybody, know anybody, be co-opted by it.
Right.
And there's some of that. And the nature of the Republican Party has shifted. It used to be, when we all grew up, David and I grew up, where there was a tremendous overlap in the parties. Jack Javits and Ken Keating and Clifford Case and Hugh Scott. The whole Northeast was packed with moderate Republicans. Every state had 1 or 2 Republican senators, all the way out to the Midwest. And there were Midwestern, real Lincoln-esque Republicans. I'm just reading Todd Purdum's great new book on the Civil Rights Act. I was looking at the galleys. And there's a wonderful, I was crying reading about Bill McCullough, a guy from the Midwest, who supported with no blacks in his district, when stuck his neck completely out for the Civil Rights Bill. And so did Charlie Halleck. And so, as you said, Everett Dirksen. These guys were not going to gain politically. The pattern was set pretty much in the 60s that black Americans were going to vote Democrat. They did it because they believed in it. And it's just wonderful the way that Republican Party, only 6 Republican senators, I believe, voted against the Civil Rights Act, whereas 22 Democrat segregationists voted against it. The fight was a bipartisan fight, and it was a victory for both parties. A wonderful thing, but a lot of it was this relationship you talk about. I think Ike probably had a relationship like that with Sam Rayburn, where they would divvy up who Ike set foreign policy, as he should have, and Rayburn had huge majorities in the House and the Senate would set domestic pretty much. And they agreed on that. But then they would do things like the highway bill and to create the Department of HEW. And they would do a lot of things in joint agreement, but there was a sense of balance and understanding of the relationship. It wasn't this fighting over little things like this thing today. This was so pint-sized, this deal. The fact that there were voices screaming betrayal, sellout, was absurd. It was nothing. That's the biggest critique. It should have been, this is nothing. But they didn't, they fought over it.
Let me give you another example. Because I so think this is generational in a significant degree. That World War II generation, I think, was just so different. But I remember back in 1978, 79, the summer, George H.W. Bush Sr., was thinking about running for president. And he called me and asked me if I'd help him with his campaign. And I really didn't know him well. And so he invited me to Kennebunkport to spend a weekend with him, which I did. And when I arrived, can you imagine how impressed I was? Here was a guy who was thinking of running for the Republican nomination for the president. His house guest that weekend, his other house guest was a Democratic member of Congress and his wife. That just told me a lot about sort of the nature, not just the nature of the man, but just the nature of politics, which was much more on a human scale and not so ideologically driven, but had a much greater sense of the country comes first.
And aren't they all now, especially in Congress, isn't there this problem of if you in any way show bipartisanship, when you're in one of these tough districts, you get primaried, right? I mean, and that's another reason, by the way, for getting back to your district as quickly as possible. So you've got this 50-50
That's
nation.
bipartisan, by the way.
Yeah,
it's more extreme on the right, but you cannot lose. If you're representing Harlem, for example, up here in New York,
right?
Charlie Rangel doesn't have to worry about somebody going to his right.
Yeah.
He can't lose to somebody to his right. He can only lose to a younger guy or younger woman to his left. Right. You go out in Utah, you can only lose to somebody younger than you to your right. So all the pressure's on you to hang to the polls in both parties. You never hear of a moderate knocking off an ideologue. Doesn't happen. And by the way, as I said, there's no overlap anymore. There's no moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats that overlap. There's just a clear division.
Because of redistricting?
No, in the Senate.
Because of the Senate, okay.
The redistricting is a big part of it.
Yeah.
Because, and there's one weird functional thing that I think people would understand. Why is there always a fight between the Republican House and the Democratic president? Part of it is pretty much jurisdictional. 232 House districts, CDs, congressional districts, voted for Mitt Romney. 232, a strong majority. So that's why you'll hear Republican state officials say, why don't we make the Electoral College be driven by the congressional districts rather than by winner take all? Because by that nature, by that system, they would win the presidency rather handily. And that's what you have in Pennsylvania, for example, where 100,000 more people voted Democrat for Congress, but there's 13 Republican congresspeople in Pennsylvania and 5 Democrats because of Philadelphia being 85% Democrat, Berkeley 85%, San Francisco 85%, New York City 80 or whatever, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago. All the big urban areas are minorities and liberal whites, and they vote overwhelmingly for the Democrats, and if you, in this sense, waste all those votes because they go 85%. And all these suburban areas will go 52-48 Republican. So it's a lot of it's just the segregated housing. A lot of it has to do with that.
Yeah, and the other part of the redistricting definitely has played a role. It's been done over time. There's been a quiet conspiracy between the two parties to divide up the seats. You take these, we'll leave very few in the middle, and we're safe, and those are safe seats. That happened some years ago. That trend started happening. And then the House became increasingly partisan and increasingly polarized. And one of the things that Chris and I both noticed is what you've had is some people graduate from a very politicized body in the House, and they go into the Senate, and they bring those patterns of behavior with them into the Senate. And the Senate, which used to have a club-like atmosphere, people would have, there was a dining chamber where they'd have lunch together, on a pretty regular basis across the aisle. That is increasingly disappearing.
I hear they don't even eat in that dining room anymore.
They don't eat in that dining room anymore.
They don't eat together anymore.
Eat at their desks.
They spend most of their time, I talked to, you go talk to senators about it. Look, they spend most of their lunches now going to their party caucus rooms where they spend lunch villainizing the other side, as opposed to having done lunch with them. That makes a big difference in how you think about.
It used to be the committee chairs were the powers.
Yeah.
Top aide to Bobby Byrd, who was the Democratic leader in the Senate, told me the big change was those weekly meetings. Because they only talk about 2 things in the weekly meeting: resources, money, now they can all gather their money together, and 2, party regularity, discipline. Yeah. So it becomes more like the British Labour Party over in London or in Britain, where you have people automatically voting the way they're supposed to vote instead of thinking.
Right. Let's go back to Reagan and O'Neill, because it's a kind of a pleasanter thing to talk about.
I hope before we finish we can end on the positive side.
We're looking for that. Yeah.
There's a little bit out there. We don't all have to go home and get drunk tonight. There is some hope on the way. We can wait for it, but I hope we'll get to it sometime.
Well, here's something pretty hopeful. We're going to show some more videotape, and this time we're going to take one of the signal accomplishments of the Reagan administration. And by the way, he included Tip O'Neill in a lot of this. This is Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate, and you were there, right?
Yeah. Wow.
David was there, and this was a big moment based on a lot of diplomacy that had gone on, in which Tip O'Neill had actually been involved early on. Yeah, in a small part. So let's take a listen to this. It's the challenge to the Soviet leader.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So there's a huge moment. You're there, and tell us what that felt like. I mean, was that stagecraft, or did you know that there was something shaking within the Reagan administration, that there was something shaking within the Soviet Union, that Gorbachev was a different kind of thinker?
Oh, it was clear. Gorbachev was. 3 different Soviet leaders had died like that, and Reagan couldn't sit down with anybody because they kept dying. But Gorbachev came in with, with glasnost and a very perestroika, just a very, very different sensibility, and it opened the door to President Reagan, sort of saying, okay, and I'll walk through this. Now, Gorbachev, historians give Gorbachev most of the credit for ending the Cold War, but I think Ronald Reagan deserves a lot too, because he understood, and I think more than in that speech, the Star Wars proposal, when he made that, nobody in the United States knew whether that would work. In fact, most scientists thought it wouldn't work, but in the Kremlin, they thought it might work.
I agree.
And in effect, because he stood tough, and they knew he wasn't bluffing, the air traffic controllers deal, when he took them on, showed that this was a guy who was tough. And diplomacy usually is best practice when there is a glove extended to the other side, but there's an iron fist inside it. And people pay attention to that. They understand, they respect that. And Reagan also had, which was very important, that was a time when there was much more bipartisan support for foreign policy, and politics didn't quite stop at the waterline, but it was more often than not the politics stopped at the waterline. And that era is gone, and now you've got Richard Haas had a piece yesterday in this Politico package that I mentioned earlier. Richard Haas is head of the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York, and he had a wonderful piece about Congress is meddling too much in foreign policy. It making it very difficult for this president, and indeed other presidents, to govern. They don't have trade authority. For example, this president doesn't have trade authority right now. And, the Chinese are out cutting deals with everybody right and left, and our president basically got one hand tied behind his back.
Chris, you spoke with President Obama. You interviewed him last week. Do you get a sense that when it comes to foreign policy that he hears footsteps? I mean, he's trying to cut a deal of some kind, it looks like, with Iran. Who knows exactly? Can you hazard a thought on that?
Well, I think he's been consistent on that. I mean, that's where he said, I'm not going to be W.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to wind down 2 wars and avoid any more. And he's been pressured with regard to Libya first, and Syria, and now Iran. And I think he's handled this. I think John Kerry's done a great job. I mean, we know, if we think it through, whether we're Likudnik or we're somewhere over there with Yossi Baron, whatever your pro-Israeli politics are thinking is, that no American president will survive who lets them weaponize. It'll never, I don't care who the president, he's gone or she's gone if they let it happen. So in the end, after trying this diplomatic approach, there will be a time when we'll see whether it's working or not. And at that point, we have to choose with the Israelis, perhaps, how we act then militarily. But so it is a risk, though, because he took some hit today from Posner today, took a big shot at him. And it wasn't Posner, who was it today? One of the big neocons really whacked him today. Podores whacked him today. Very strong piece today. Calling for an Israeli attack right now, which I think is
Norman Podores.
Very tough. Yeah. But I think he knew that was coming, and I think he's been pretty strong on this. I want to get back to something that was really great for Reagan, and I battled him hard for 6 years. The end of the Cold War really did come about the way David said it did, because the Soviets, the Russian mind is always to find an American to do business with. It's very Russian. They always have to have their American. Well, one of their Americans was Dwayne Andreas, head of Archer Daniels Midland. And he came back from one of his trips over there, and they love dealing with capitalists. One thing they do, they don't like liberals or socialists. As everybody knows, the great irony, everybody knows any politics, knows that communists hate socialists and hate liberals. What they really like are big-time capitalists because they think they call the shots. And sometimes
because
they do.
They want to be a capitalist.
And they want some of the loot. but basically, he came back and told the speaker right after the Patco strike was broken. He said they heard that one in Moscow. That they knew this was a guy to do. This wasn't Carter. This wasn't another politician. This was a guy with an iron fist. And then, just as you say, that played a role in them saying, "Okay, we can do business with this guy. He's tough." And you always look for a strong negotiating partner. The whites in Africa, I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in Africa. One thing I learned about the whites over there, that small minority, they love strong black leaders. Love them. They can protect the peace. They can protect property. They can keep order. They don't want loosey-goosey. They don't want tribal leaders. They want a strong national leader like Kenyatta or Mandela. They were thrilled to get Mandela as a leader of the black majority because he was a real leader, and he was going to keep things in line. So you always want a strong opponent. You want a strong negotiating partner. They had one in Reagan.
Yeah. But Chris, how much do you think, what's the role of the media in all of this now from your perspective?
Well, I think there's one person in the media I exempt from my rule of not criticizing the media, which I don't think it's appropriate for somebody in the media to criticize somebody else in it. It's like a baseball player criticizing another baseball player. It seems wrong. But Rush Limbaugh is powerful. I think he's a very powerful person in this country, and I think when he says something, people snap to. And I think that's why he's fair game to criticize politically, because he is enormously powerful.
And?
I don't think it's good. I think he moves the Republican Party to the right.
But do you think...
and it's because he has a brilliant audience. His career, he once told me that he couldn't make it in San Francisco because he couldn't, and he was a young man, but he was in his 30s. He was pushed down to Sacramento, was the biggest place he could get a job in. He couldn't get any guests to come up to Sacramento. So he did his own show for 3 hours. Yeah. He just talks, which is different than most shows. Therefore, he has a very strong argument. And basically, he talks to people between 12 and 3, in rush hour. In travel time, you talk to normal people. Normal people are traveling in rush hour. He doesn't want to talk to normal. He wants to talk to that ticked-off traveling salesman who has really got a hell of a job.
Long-haul
who doesn't get enough respect, and he attacks the feminazis, affirmative action, minorities. He does the whole thing because he knows that guy wants to hear that support group talk. It's a support group.
You get to criticize him. That's good.
Yeah, but
I can criticize him because he's powerful.
But this is not a criticism. Look, I sort of have one foot in the media, and I share some of the blame for what's going on. But I was deeply troubled when talking to Olympia Snowe, and I've heard the same story from other senators who are moderates. The voice of the moderates is not particularly welcome in the press and in the sort of modern media. Now, here's what happened to Olympia. This happened more than once. She got called on a Tuesday saying, "Would you like to come on one of our Sunday chat shows? We'd love to have you on as a guest. We're going to pair," she was a Republican, "we're going to pair you up with a Democrat." And she said, "Yes, I'm happy to do it. I'll change my schedule. I'll stay here. I won't go to Maine this weekend, and I'll do it." The next day, she got a call from a producer saying, "Listen, we need to pre-interview you. And what you're going to say, we've got this Democrat now. What are you going to say?" She said, "Well, he and I disagree on this and this, but I think we can find common ground on issue 1, 2, and 3. And I'd love to find common ground." That was on Wednesday. On Thursday, she got a call saying, "Sorry, we've canceled." And then she turned on the TV that weekend, and there'd be 2 firebrands finding no common ground who've been put on the air because it builds ratings.
Yeah.
Because, throwing things at each other builds ratings. And that is, I think that all of us who are in the press feel that you're fighting for eyeballs, you're fighting for people's time. Your audience is, sort of disappearing all around. And so how do you do that? You grab for something that's more sensational. And I do think that part of the reason that if you want to be heard in today's media, you've got sometimes to say things that are more extreme in order to get on the air.
Yeah, so how does the moderate voice get back in there?
That's a hard question.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any sense?
I think watch my show, make your own judgment. I think I argue for what I've been arguing for right here tonight. Get together, make a deal.
Yeah.
And I have people on my network who are different. I always think there's different cups of tea there. And everybody's different. I'm always amazed when somebody says they watch all of us. I'm always amazed at that. But, we're all a little different. And I think I'm sort of a doppelganger to Scarborough in a way. I think we sort of match up center left, center right. I think I enjoy the theatrical aspect of my job a lot. I think the comic aspect of it a lot. People aren't force-fed to watch me. It's not a duty to watch me like Meet the Press. I think has a dutiful audience in many cases. Who watch because they feel like, oh, I watched Meet the Press this morning. I'm in control of the news. I'm a civic person, I don't think they get that after watching me, but they feel a lot better about the country. They're more involved. They're more informed. But you have to, what I do, I'm very proud of what I do. It's different than, I think what's happened with television. I used to deliver the Bulletin as a kid, the big paper in Philly, of course, the afternoon paper, and it wasn't a newspaper because it had to be done at noon. Because there didn't have much news in it. What it had was the great columnists, James J. Kilpatrick and people like that, and you would bring them home to people. And my dad or somebody would do it on the train, but most dads would sit around and read all the opinions. After supper, they didn't rush to the television. There wasn't Jeopardy and all that stuff on, or my show. They read the paper after supper. And they got all the opinions in their heads. Well, what our kind of program, when it's done well, is like the op-ed page of a good afternoon newspaper, which doesn't exist anymore. And so I think that's what we are. We're opinion. And if you I always say facts have to be straight, I go crazy if there's something ever wrong. We don't have a corrections page. And you never hear anybody say we had a fact wrong last night. So you better damn well get it right. But we're also heat-seeking. You know, we look for the conflict.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's what happened on that Sunday show.
But that's it. And Chris, I think Chris represents, to me, the old school in a lot of ways. That's one of the reasons I'm very attracted to a lot of what he does in journalism. But there is this temptation to look for the controversy and not look for the common ground. And, you know, it's just an overwhelming sort of thing. You are drawn to that and drawn to saying things that, you know, that get a little more outrageous. It's a little bit about the way the public discourse about sexual matters. You know, 20 years ago, people you talked here, and then somebody wanted to be noticed, and they'd raise it up a little bit. You know, they'd start saying words that weren't quite acceptable, and gradually it keeps moving. And now people say the damnedest things in public. You know, it's sort of, and we all know that.
But there's also this new kind of PC thing. Excuse me, what's wrong with the president having a good time with the Prime Minister of Denmark? What is that? I agree with Jonathan. Tapart, that's a non-traversy.
Did you
that
see
is
the
a
picture?
non-event.
Did you see the picture?
You know, for the first time in months, I envied the guy. Sorry.
But everything.
I know the picture of Michelle. Did you see
No,
the
I
picture of
meant
Michelle?
him.
Yeah, did you see the picture of Michelle?
He looked happy.
Yeah.
But
So did Cameron.
The AFP photographer said, look, you know, all of us have had photos taken, and you've got your eyes half closed. I mean, Michelle was just looking off to the side. She wasn't
Yeah, right.
Look, that was, the photographer said so.
Yeah.
I know what he said.
They're looking off to the side, but those were daggers coming out of there, you know.
I don't know. So we're going to go to audience questions in a few minutes, but I just thought maybe one last venture back down memory lane.
So if Bill was doing that, would there have been a story?
Well, depends on what era
No,
of
just
Bill.
chatting away with the attractive woman next door. I mean, it's not. I think it's fun.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's fun.
Yeah. Let's go back to the 80s, and maybe a last thing to talk about. This is a little serious, but remember the part in your book about the Bolin Amendment and the whole Iran-Contra thing, which was really the low point of the Reagan presidency. You were out of the administration by then, but
That's where they really disagreed.
yeah.
They had two different worldviews. One was the classic East-West board game, the world map. You know, it's going pink here, it's going red here. We all believed in that. Vietnam was a big part of that sense of creeping red and pink around the world. China, Eastern Europe, and then countries like Algeria started to go pink. And you go, oh my God, they're circling us. And here they are in Central America, and Reagan was still thinking they're coming to get us, they're moving. And by the way, I bumped into somebody a long time ago who said, yeah, we are coming. So, I mean, they thought what they were doing. But he saw it that way. Tip saw it from the old imperialism. To him, it just fit into his sort of worldview about the rich exploiting the poor. And United Fruit was based in Boston. And he also heard from all the Maryknoll nuns and his family who kept him up to date, and Anna exactly, who told him all about it. And he thought that the real issue was poverty and social justice and the fact that the Sandinistas weren't that bad. And so they were totally at odds on that. But it did turn into a desperate move by Poindexter and North, who really felt they were being circumvented by the Congress, and they went the other ways to get the money.
Yeah, in some ways, at that point, Reagan got into that problem after his landslide second victory, and he's at the height of his power. So when you don't have that counterbalancing force, you know, Tip O'Neill is kind of...
No, he had the wrong chief of staff.
Yeah.
That was his problem.
I agree with that.
I think he wasn't keen enough on the personality, capability, and ambitions of his new chief of staff. He had the perfect one for 4 years, and he allowed those guys to move the chairs around.
I'm not sure what you're trying to get to, so I don't.
Well, I'm just trying to. My thought is that you've got, you know, that criticism, that listening to the criticism. If you'd listened to O'Neill, if you'd listened to Bolin, if you'd listened to the people who really had issues with the whole operation going on there, you might not have gotten into the problem of Iran-Contra. I mean, that was just such a cockamamie scheme, wasn't it? To approach the Iranians, to get the money from the Iranians, to go and support the Contras.
Yeah, but I don't. You know. Look, I think Chris is absolutely on target that you had a chief of staff who was good at many things, but he was not good at being chief of staff. You know, he had a significant ego. During the time he was chief of staff, it's hard to find a picture of Reagan in which he's not in there. You know, as sort of the vice president or the president-to-be. And he had a renegade guy in Ollie North. who was who was just sort of he had a lot of latitude. I don't think there's any real evidence that Reagan sort of knew, although he might have. He was also older at that time, and we all know that he wasn't suffering yet, and he was suffering from age, not Alzheimer's at that point, from all accounts. But he was older, and he didn't have a firm grip on the wheel, and he had a bad chief of staff, so he got him in real trouble. But I actually think that the real story and all of that is the way they recovered from it.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a tale relevant to the President Obama. And that was, how does he rescue his presidency? How does he now, he's in serious danger of becoming a lame duck with basically 3 years to go, which would not be healthy for the country. And he's got a Congress that, is dysfunctional. And that's a dangerous thing for the country. This is not a good time. These next few years are going to be precious for us in terms of how we respond, how we educate our kids, how they can get good jobs in a highly competitive world. And right now we have a Washington that's broken down. So there's a lot. And Reagan, like Clinton, had a crisis in his second term, and both of them figured out how to recover from it and go ahead and govern.
So how can President Obama?
I think that is a jackpot question right now. Because I think it's going to be hard. I think he's got to get this healthcare thing fixed. I think bringing in John Podesta was a very, very good move, but he's got a long way to go. And he gave this interview to Chris a few days ago, which I was quite stunned by, because he said basically it's not a managerial problem in the White House. The problem is out in the agencies. I don't know how you responded to that.
I
was quite stunned by it.
I didn't like it.
You what?
I didn't like it.
Because?
I mean, I think his fundamental problem, which I've been saying for months, is the way he doesn't run the White House and the government. There ought to be a strong chief of staff below him, who's the chief operating officer, that gets done all the things he wants to get done and gets rid of anybody who's not doing it, and making sure the words translate into reality. And the fact that there wasn't a direct line of unique accountability between the President of the United States, who'd run on and won the toughest, most historic thing he'd ever do, the health care bill, and didn't check every day or two with a top kick who was responsible for that rollout. And he didn't even have such a person. There was no person to fire.
Azar.
That's the frightening thing. The COO of the CMS of the HHS was the one that Kathleen Sebelius pointed to in that hearing when Marsha Blackburn hit her with the serious question, who is in charge? And she took a while, and then she said, well, that's over at CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicare Services. And under that person, it's the COO, not even the top person. That's crazy. The president, I said, are you spokes of the wheel or are you strong chief of staff? And he said, both. No, I don't think he's either. He doesn't have a strong chief of staff. Everybody knows Valerie Jarrett is the key person in the White House and that Billy Daley wasn't the boss. And everybody knows that whoever is in there answers to this Michelle or Valerie or somebody has more influence than they do. And it's clear that there's a mush, a confusion there. And what it goes down to is you don't have anybody to call up and blame. And I'm used to, as David is, a regimental form of government. Jim Baker knew exactly who blew it. And when I worked in campaigns, there was one guy in charge of press, usually me, and if anything went wrong, it was your fault. And that was the way it worked. I don't get this White House. Nobody's been fired because nobody can be identified as being responsible. That's the incredible thing.
Now, to go back memory lane for a minute, let's remember how Reagan dealt with Iran-Contra. First place, the Congress wanted to investigate it, and he could have stonewalled. Instead, he said, turn over all the documents, and everybody testifies. We're not going to call in executive privilege here. We're not going to try to exercise that. Totally open and transparent. Okay. He brought in David Abshire and some other people, brought in John Tower, to do a top-to-bottom search of what the hell went wrong here and what do we need to do to fix it. No such thing has happened on health care. And David Abshire came in, a guy who started the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he was at the time NATO ambassador, first class. And they went through top to bottom. Here's how we change things, all the process, the management of the White House. And then he brought in Howard Baker to be his new chief of staff, Ken Duberstein to be his deputy chief of staff, and Colin Powell to be his national security advisor. He brought in some heavy hitters, some strong people, and said, we're starting out anew. And the rest of his time in the White House was productive. He recovered, and he got the deal.
That was Nancy who did that, right? Nancy and Bob Strauss.
Nancy had a lot to do with it. Bob Strauss, a Democrat. had been chairman of the Democratic National Committee.
So you're both calling for
was a friend of Reagan.
You both like the idea of having somebody responsible, maybe firing somebody, and then house cleaning every once in a while.
Responsibility is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
I mean,
You know why? Because we only elect one guy,
Yeah.
a woman.
yeah.
And we elect that person, is the only lever we have is that lever for that one person. That person has to have everybody else respond to him or her personally. That's the way it works, because that's the only lever we have as voters. Let's pick the president. He has to be in charge. I don't sense he has been on this regard to the most important thing he had. Who was in charge? And that's the way, I don't want to beat a dead horse, because I love the effort here. I think the Republicans in a billion years wouldn't have done health care. But this president has tried it. He had the guts to get it through. He ran it. He won election. He got reelected in a very difficult time. He knows how to get things done. But for some reason, the executive role, which is what I asked him about last week, you are the CEO, you. And I don't think he likes that indictment. I don't think he wants, no, he doesn't want that. He has floaters around at the White House, floaters getting in the way of people who don't have clear jobs. And now he's bringing in counselors. He doesn't need 3 or 4 counselors. He needs one chief of staff who's in charge and kicks butt.
Yeah.
And then that way he'll know every morning who's not doing their job. Now, if he wants to do spokes of the wheel like Kennedy did, if he was that vigorous and liked doing it, Jack Kennedy was a junior officer from World War II. And he knew how to get on the phone with everybody at that middle level. And if you go back and see 13 Days or a movie, any account of the Cuban Missile Crisis, how he got through it, was his ability to cut through the bureaucracy and call the pilot, and say you weren't shot when you were down. Remember the pilot doing the flyovers? Don't say you were shot. He was that kind of a hands-on guy, spokes of the wheel, out there with speechwriters and everybody else. But the president said, I'm doing both. I have a strong, he doesn't have a strong chief of staff. And as for that role of spokes of the wheel, I don't buy it yet. Because he should have been talking directly to somebody at HHS then. And I don't think he was.
Yeah, we need to remember that leadership is not just about creating headlines and giving great speeches and getting elected. And it's not even just about getting bills passed. It is also about executing the laws and managing it so you get things done. One of the worst problems we got in politics is that in our national politics, people don't feel they're responsible and they don't even know how to get things done. One of the things about New York that I've admired, and I happen to be a fan of the Bloomberg administration. They haven't got everything right, but I think they've been very good. I'll tell you, I voted for President Obama in 2008. I did not want to vote for him in 2012. I couldn't take the Republican side either. I did a write-in for Mike Bloomberg. And because what's happened here in New York is that people are getting things done. I mean, this is a different city than what it was. Yes, there's too much poverty. Yes, stop and frisk has to be examined, and a lot of things that need to be addressed about inequality. But this is a qualitatively better city today than it was 20 years ago.
So, David,
that's because these are people who are chief executives in exactly the way Chris is talking about. They take responsibility and they get it done.
I think de Blasio had a good start, first of all.
Yeah, I think
picking Bratton was
first
rate. So I think there's a good sign that he's going to be. He's not going to be loosey-goosey. This city is very sensitive to crime and murder rate. If there's any change in that, there's going to be a price to pay quickly. People know how safe they are.
So we've got questions from the audience.
They know it.
Let's just stay on that theme for the first question, which is, in your respective opinions, who are the good common ground politicians these days?
Christie.
Christie is.
Oh, it's tough. I need the Republican. Tough.
You don't have your audience this time. What do you think?
I don't care. Blow it.
It's yours to win, David.
No, look, I think one.
The only popular picture of the 2012 election, the only popular picture was those guys walking to the beach together.
Yeah.
The only thing that made people happy. The only sign. The grown-ups are getting along.
I agree with Chris, but Christie has reached out and has not been the sort of the ideological Republican. You have to give him credit for that. But listen, I think one of the encouraging signs is that we are starting to elect a small number, but still significant number of people to Washington, to the House and the Senate, especially the Senate, of people who are anxious to find middle ground. Mark Warner, Virginia, Democrat, has really been working hard to cross party lines. Rob Portman, Republican, Ohio, both freshmen. I think he's a pretty much, a center-right kind of guy. Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire. You can go through the list. I think there are people on both sides now. They're a minority now, but it's a minority to be encouraged because maybe one day we can build a majority of people who are willing to work together.
Yeah, I think I want to disaggregate a little bit. I think there's some things where Chuck Schumer is really a grown-up on. Other times he plays the politics. But I'll say an example where he is a grown-up on, and he and Lindsey Graham are on it, and the late Ted Kennedy, was those guys understood the nature of a comprehensive immigration reform law. It's a law. It's not just something to deal with certain interest groups or concerns about humanity even. It's about what law do you want to pass that you of good conscience will enforce. That's my standard. Don't pass another law like Simpson-Mazzoli that wasn't going to be enforced. Write a law that you believe is progressive, American, and you are willing with all your conscience to enforce. You don't hear that from almost anybody, but you did hear it from Ted, you hear it from Chuck and Lindsey. The rest of them are all playing interest group politics or not doing anything. The hardest thing about immigration reform is stopping the flow of illegal immigrants and at the same time giving citizenship to the people who have been here. That's a very hard nut to crack because you're going to make somebody mad with any part of it. And I think it's tough. But the rest of it is just talk. And that's why we're probably not going to get an immigration bill.
We should.
We're not going to get one because nobody wants to do all of it.
We definitely need it.
Path to citizenship and enforcement. And that means no more illegal hiring, no more exploitation of cheap labor. And business doesn't want to go along with that. And I'm not sure the Democrats are really serious about that.
I think it also means a respect for and an understanding that the Latino community in this country can be an enormous asset for us if we give them a fair break in life.
What advice would you give the President and the Speaker today if they asked you what they needed to do to break the deadlock and move forward? That's the big one.
I think on the debt, if the President is with Paul Krugman and believes that that's not the issue, it's just growth, focus on growth, and that really we can sustain a national debt which exceeds, well, it is going to exceed our GDP. If that, I don't know where he thinks the tipping point is. He probably denies there is one. But if he honestly wants, if the President really believes that, say so and stop talking about debt reduction. I think there's so much BS out there. The people say they want debt reduction on the Republican side, but their priority is no taxes. The Democrats say they want debt reduction with a lot less fervor, and they say don't touch entitlements. So as long as debt reduction remains everybody's second priority, it'll never be dealt with. And that's the way it is now. They all say it, but they're much more concerned about no revenue increase and no entitlement changes. So in effect, we're going to talk about this. It'll be in the newspapers the rest of our life, and nothing will get done because they don't. Republicans are much more concerned with the no new taxes than they are with this. I think the Republicans do care more about it. I mean, I think they really do go to bed at night. My dad used to do this, worrying about the deficit all the time. A Republican worries about the deficit because they worry about paying bills, and they do worry more than Democrats, I think. And yet, they're not doing anything because they've got this right-wing crazy crowd. Just, what's that guy's name? The guy that runs that no tax thing, Grover Nordquist. They're so afraid of him nailing them, they don't want to do anything that's even reasonable. But I think the urgency is it. My bottom line is that both sides did like they did in the 80s and said, you know what, boys and girls, we got to do this. So that's the most important that we agree on. We have to do this. We're going to reduce the growth in the debt, or we're going to deal with the growth of these entitlements, which are unsustainable the way they're going. We're going to deal with them. And that's what we're going to do. And we're going to agree by a certain near-term date to do this. That means both sides have to give. The problem today is nobody agrees on the urgency, and therefore neither side really has to give. And that's why they just did this debt deal today, because there's no urgency to do it.
What are the odds of that, of a grand bargain or anything like that ever happening, David?
In the next 3 years?
Well, just in our lifetime, how about?
Well, I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist about the country. I just think we're going to be in a muddle-through posture, very likely. Just taking care of the necessities, but not dealing with the underlying. And what we've got is a ridiculous way to approach the deficits right now. We're cutting spending. We ought to be investing in things like infrastructure, and we ought to be making sure that and instead of cutting social spending and taking the safety net from out of people when unemployment is still such a terrible problem, we really need to be reforming Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and get on with it. We can protect today's seniors. We should protect them. But there are ways, just as the cities are having to sort of deal with their hard realities, especially, say, a city like Detroit, it's time for the country to sort of deal with the underlying realities and stop playing games with this. And, I'm not sure there is an answer right now over the next 3 years. My hope is, of course, that the next president will be able to start afresh. But I think Chris is right about the urgency. It's just, we're so bollocksed up now. We're so wound into it, and we got ourselves wrapped around the axle. My just hope is they, over the next 3 years, they do no harm.
So
I would buy that. I would buy that.
That's a good policy.
Well, it's one hell of a lot better than we got now.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've watched and we've seen 1,000 eulogies now to Nelson Mandela, and we've seen the funeral. We're going to see the funeral over the weekend. Is there anything? This is a question. Is there more we can learn from Nelson Mandela and his story here? I think perhaps of the idea of the big generous gesture. He had every reason in the world, and black South Africans had every reason in the world to be very, very angry and vindictive when it came to what had happened to them over the years. But there was that big gesture, that big-hearted gesture. Do you think, you talked about a lame duck Obama administration, is there anything he can do to sort of step up and cross the aisle in some way? Is there anything like that, or is there anything happening on the Republican side that would, can you just imagine a scenario where you could see some great thing like that happen, or not?
It's tough because the Republican Party is really kind of divided right now. But
Yeah.
I did spend 2 years in the Peace Corps in Swaziland, right next to South Africa, reading the newspapers all the time. They're really good papers, and reading about that strange society where you had Christian Bernard doing the first heart transplant, that incredibly sophisticated part of the society. And then the petty apartheid laws, the passbook laws, the Morality Act, which they called anything to do with racial mixing. And it was to show a society can be very sophisticated and also completely screwed up. And but I did think Invictus was the great story of his coming out when he rooted for the Springboks, the South African pretty much all white rugby team. But I do think when I interviewed him, and I perhaps more when he came out, I interviewed him, but in that election. But I was down there voting with Bishop Tutu the day he voted, and I got to walk around with Tutu from the very nice place he lives at the Bishop's Court, where the Archbishop of Cape Town lives, in a very leafy, beautiful suburb, over to a terrible place, Guguletu, a township where they had killed a white woman from California just because she was a settler, as they called her. But then I went out and watched people voting that day, and I had never seen anything I was there for the Berlin Wall thing, but I'd never seen anything as dramatic as people waiting in line from one horizon to another. And with nothing, with no water, no tea, no coffee, no bathroom, just say, he said this is how we're going to do it. We're going to do this through democracy. We know we have the numbers, but we're going to go through this democratically. And I remember going up to, there were mixed race people, what they call coloreds down there. There were white people voting in line. And I remember going to a line and I walked up, there was this white woman, young woman in her 20s, I'd say. And we had the camera on her, and she said, this is the day I've waited for my whole life. So there was this wonderful positive feeling about democracy, even though they were turning over the government to a black majority. He did that. Who else could have orchestrated that over a period of a couple of years after coming out? He wouldn't come out till they legalized his party. That was really, he was sitting in prison because he was ruling that country from within prison. He was saying, unless you legalize, and the minute I heard that he had legalized not just his party, but the Communist Party, I knew then it was for real. And a lot of people in journalism in Washington didn't know when F.W. Kirk came over here. People like Ben Bradley didn't know it. I had been down there to know. The minute you legalized the ANC and the Communist Party, the whites had given up. And he organized, not a person was shot. We all thought it was inevitably going to be a bloodbath, with the whites with supreme firepower being able to defend themselves if there was any kind of real revolution. It would have been horrible. It could have been happening right now, probably would have been happening by now. And he said, we're going to do it a different way. We're going to do it through democracy. And hopefully, with all the weak leaders that have succeeded him, South Africa will find a way to go good democracy because he set them on the road to it.
So we've got to wrap up, David. But I just thought maybe the last thing I would do is roll this last question into a last thought for the two of you. How can the public best encourage politicians today to make the paradigm shift back to Americans and not Republicans and Democrats? In other words, what can the public do? We've critiqued politicians, right? We've critiqued old and new politicians. But is there anything the public can do to change this discourse, to put pressure on? Or
Well, quickly, because David knows this, Hillary Clinton will be very much old school that way. She is very friendly with Republicans like John McCain. She's very collegial. She's seasoned, which is a good thing. We haven't talked about how the problem of this president being not seasoned and coming here with a lot of relationships. You gotta come to the office with the relationships. You can't meet people in the White House. You can't audition them. You got to know the people to put in your cabinet, the second people you want in, the third rank, the fourth rank. You got to know who you're going to pick for a second term long before you get in there. And you have to know a lot of people to know who to deal with for years. And she's got that going. And I think that would be one of her strengths, to pick a person who really is involved in American political life.
If she were elected, I hope that she forms a national government. Yeah, I think it's time we had a government that was really much more representative. This is what Churchill did during the war. And this is what Franklin Roosevelt did as we entered the war. He formed a national government, and we reached that point where whoever wins.
What is national government?
National government is when, and John Kennedy did it. When John Kennedy became president, he understood we faced a lot of deep issues and deep divisions. He asked a Republican to be his Secretary of Defense, a Republican to be head of the CIA, a Republican to be the Secretary of the Treasury, and a Republican to be the National Security Advisor in the White House. And it made a big difference in the way the country saw that they came together. And during the 13 days, it made a huge difference to have them there. But look, I have the privilege now working, spend a lot of my time in classrooms, and I can tell you help is on the way. I am really impressed by the quality of the next generation, the younger generation is coming through now.
That's right.
And you see them, there are two streams of people coming out. There's one that people who are deeply committed to social change, and they don't want to go into government so much. They want to go into nonprofits. They want to come here and work for Robin Hood. They want to go into Teach for America. They want to do City Year. I'm on the board for Teach for America, and I just tell you, Wendy Kopp is one of the many women leaders now emerging. She's wonderful. She has an organization that asks people to teach in the toughest classrooms. There are 1,000 of them here in New York. We have 4,700 new core members this year. We had 47,000 applications. At Harvard 4 years ago, 9% of the class applied for Teach for America coming out, senior class. This past year, 20%. 1 out of 5 Harvard students said, I don't want to go to Wall Street, I want to go to the South Bronx and teach in the 8th grade. That is real progress. And the other stream of people are coming out, second stream, are these, and it's the silver lining from 12 years of war. We got kids coming out, but coming back and taking off their uniforms now after serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Knock your socks off. They are people of wide bandwidth. They've served the country. They served under one flag. And they believe in that. And they're coming back here and saying, I'd like to help back here. And they're joining forces with the social entrepreneurs, people like the Wendy Kopps of the world. And you see a merger now happening, an alliance happening. And let me tell you, I'll close this one story. I met this kid last year. He's so typical of this generation. This is a young man who finished high school, decided to go in the Marine Corps. He enlisted in the Marine Corps. Didn't go officer, enlisted coming out of high school. And they made him a sniper. He had 3 tours in Iraq. Being a sniper is very traumatizing for many people. You don't push a button and see, and you hear an explosion miles away you never see. You look down the barrel of a gun, you pull the trigger, and you see somebody's head explode. That can be very traumatizing. He did that, 3 tours. Came back, thought maybe he could get into Harvard, applied to Harvard. Got in. Finished this last spring. And you know what he's doing now? Teaching in an 8th grade, Teach for America. That's the spirit of the generation. So from my point of view, one of the things we can do is to work with this next generation, help build them up. And those of us who are older need to clean up our acts to the extent we can, and we need to get the heck off the stage and invite this new generation up.
That was great.
Not tonight.
I think you guys have given us something to look forward to, which is, you've got something in the future, and especially the generational idea. I think that's wonderful. Thanks for a great evening. I mean, this was just fantastic. Before we go, Bruce Bond was going to come back out and say a few words, I think. Is that right, Bruce? Yeah, okay. And then we'll say goodbye.
I agree. It was an amazing evening. Thank you, guys. Let's have a hand. So, just a little audience informal polling before we go. So, first question, how many of you as a result, and could we bring the lights up just a little bit, please? How many of you as a result of what you heard tonight learned something of significance about the O'Neill-Reagan relationship? Please raise your hand. Oh my goodness, probably about 80% of you. Second question, David, you mentioned you're a long-term optimist. How many of you share that vision? Please raise your hand. Okay, so that means we have a little more work to do, so I would encourage you to continue to come to our events because we're going to prove to you that it's doable. Thank you again to our speakers, John, David, and Chris.